All right, so welcome back. This is the second lecture of the introductory module where we're laying down some basic foundational concepts that will guide us through the initial portion of the class. The initial portion of the class is dedicated to basic concepts of critical thinking, and the basic task that we have is to master 3 interrelated skills. Remember what I said in the previous lecture? That is, that critical thinking is a skill or a set of skills that we need to master sequentially. And we're going to start with the simplest skill in this particular lecture, which is argument identification. How can we identify the parts of an argument? What are the parts of an argument? Why does it matter? Well, hopefully throughout this presentation, these questions will become clear. And by the end of this presentation, you'll have a basic outline, a strategy, how to find the conclusion of an argument, and then what you will find are some practice exercises to confirm whether or not you've mastered that particular skill. Those will follow as a separate posting in the module after this lecture. So the idea is read the section called What is an Argument, work through this PowerPoint, take some good notes, make sure you've got the basic concepts down, then do the exercises. Don't check the answer key that I will be posting right away. Learn to trust yourself. Get confident that you're on the right track. After you've done all the exercises, check your results, and that will tell you if you've mastered the concept or not. This is always a good idea. It's the difference between learning and studying. You can check learning. You could see whether your learning has accomplished anything by seeing how well you're doing on things like tests or exercises. Whereas studying really has no way to be measured, and so therefore it's relatively an ineffective modality or way to think about the process of acquiring knowledge. So work through this material, learn the material, test your learning, and if it turns out when you do the exercises you're not getting as many correct as maybe you had hoped, that's a sign that you need to go back and perhaps re-listen to the lecture or reread the section because it's a sign of a lack of understanding. Okay, this is pretty basic material. If you don't get this foundational material, everything we build upon it will become murky and the class will become more and more indecipherable as we go on. So set a good precedent, lay a good foundation for your future learning, and everything will go well. So let's turn to our initial question. What is an argument? You might recall from our discussion of critical thinking that the word critical often has a negative connotation. And I talked about this last time in class, where when someone is critical of us, this is usually something that we don't appreciate. This is something that we try to avoid, and we generally don't want to be critical of other people because of this negative connotation. However, in the context of critical thinking, the term critical actually has a positive connotation because it involves being able to critically discriminate good from bad arguments in this particular case. And in class, I talked about the analogy of a film critic, for example, someone who can determine which films have qualities that make them good films from which films have qualities that make them bad films. Well, in critical thinking, that's what we're trying to do with arguments, trying to determine which arguments are good arguments and which arguments are bad arguments. So that's actually a positive thing to be able to do. Now, the term argument is also one of those terms that can have a negative connotation as well. In ordinary everyday speech, when you get in an argument with someone, clearly that's not a positive thing. That's a verbal altercation or a verbal fight. And most people don't like to do that. Most people strive to avoid that. But in critical thinking, the term argument has a very different meaning, one that is not negative and in fact is extremely important for all effective positive communication. So let's see what that is. In logic and critical thinking, the term argument does not have a negative connotation. An argument is simply making a case for something. And we make a case by presenting evidence or reasons why a certain statement or belief should be accepted. So basically, an argument is just a set of statements. Now, some of these statements are presented as support or evidence for another statement. And the totality of all of these statements together is what we call an argument. And one of the most important things we try to learn in this class is how to effectively support our claims, how to effectively make strong arguments for our opinions, our beliefs, and things we take to be true, and also to be able to evaluate the arguments that are presented to us as well. Now, that definition may seem a little bit abstract, so it might be useful to have just a couple of quick examples of some arguments to get a sense of what I'm talking about. Here are a couple of examples. The first one says the following: you should floss your teeth regularly because it helps to prevent gum disease. This is an argument. What we have is a claim that you should floss your teeth regularly. And we also have another claim or statement that is intended to support that belief. Why should I floss my teeth regularly? Because it helps to prevent gum disease. So we have a reason given for the conclusion. When the reason does support the conclusion, then we have a good argument. And I think this one here is a pretty good argument. The next one says, if you want to be successful, you need to complete your education, and you want to be successful. Therefore, you need to complete your education. Again, here the conclusion is that you need to complete your education. The reasons for that conclusion, or the reasons for that claim, are that you want to be successful, and if you want to be successful, you need to complete your education. So because of those two prior statements, it follows that you need to complete your education. So what we have here are a couple of cases where reasons or evidence are given for a claim and do seem to be reasonably related to that claim and give us reasons to accept that claim. So we have examples here of two basic arguments. So as should probably be clear, the statements that comprise an argument are not all doing the same thing. Some are providing support, and one is being supported. Depending on which role these statements are serving, we give them different names. The statements that are providing the support or evidence we call the premises of an argument. Premise if there's one, premises if there's more than one. The statement that is being supported is the conclusion. It's what we are aiming towards. It's what the premises claim to lead us to. So the most basic structure an argument can have would be to consist of two statements. One statement, the premise, giving a reason, and another statement, the conclusion, being what we think is supported by that reason. And so the simplest argument you could have would be a premise and a conclusion, like our previous example. Should you desire to have healthy gums, then you should floss your teeth. So there you have a reason given for a conclusion. That is a simple argument. That's as simple as an argument can get. Most arguments do, however, have more than one premise. And the reason is that most of the time when you have a complex conclusion, you're going to need more than one simple statement to support it. Now, an argument will typically have more than one premise. An argument, however, can only have one conclusion by its very nature. So you're often going to have a situation where you have multiple reasons all adding up to or supporting a single conclusion. If you find that you're dealing with a passage of text that seems to have two conclusions, then what you really have are two separate arguments. So to recap, every argument must have at least one premise, but will usually have more. And every argument can only have one conclusion, and it cannot have more than one conclusion. So just for clarification, I want to talk about what a statement is. As we've seen, arguments are comprised of statements. So what is a statement? Well, it's not necessarily a sentence, because a sentence can contain multiple statements or multiple claims within it. A statement is basically a claim that has a truth value. That is, it's a claim that's either true or it's false. So an example of a claim would be that today is Tuesday. If today actually is Tuesday, then that claim is true. If in fact it is Saturday, and I say today is Tuesday, then I've made a statement or a claim that is false. So a statement is just a claim that's either true or false, and statements differ from other uses of language like exclamations, for example. If I stub my toe against the desk and I yell, "Ow!" Well, that expression, "ow," does not have a truth value. It's neither true nor false. It's just an expression or an exclamation of pain. Similarly, questions don't have truth values because questions are soliciting information. They don't have any value in terms of being either true or false. So only statements have truth values, and statements are the parts that make up an argument. So now that we have a pretty good sense of what an argument consists of, we have to take the steps to master the first of our skills that will lead us to be able to evaluate arguments, and that is learning to identify the parts of an argument. We know that arguments consist of conclusions that are supported by premises or reasons. So in order to begin the process of understanding an argument, we have to be able to find what the conclusion is. We have to be able to identify what the premises are, and then we have to see the relationship between them to see if it is a good or a bad argument, basically. So in order to analyze an argument into its constituent parts, our first skill, we're going to learn a 4-step procedure that can accurately identify conclusions and premises and therefore get us on our way towards evaluating complete arguments. Now, the first thing we're going to do when we're dealing with an argument is we're going to try to find the conclusion. The simplest way to do this is to, first of all, look for conclusion indicator words or phrases. As the name implies, these are words or short phrases that indicate that a conclusion is being given. And here is a partial list of some conclusion indicator words. Therefore, wherefore, thus, consequently, accordingly, hence, we may conclude, as a result, it follows that, for this reason, implies that, it must be that. So these are words that are used to indicate a conclusion is being given. Since you want to live a long, healthy life, therefore you shouldn't smoke. Now the word therefore is supporting the conclusion that you shouldn't smoke, and what came before are the reasons. Now most of these expressions we do not use in ordinary language when we're just speaking to each other. These are often used in more formal writing. You will often encounter these in textbooks or in literary sources, for example. Now, in ordinary language, the most common conclusion indicator that we use is the word so. So is often a good indicator of a conclusion. For example, it's sunny outside, I don't have to work today, so let's go to the beach. And in that case, the word so is telling you that that's the conclusion I want you to reach, that we should go to the beach. And the reasons are because it's sunny and because I do not have to work. So functions like these other words to indicate that a conclusion is being given. So the first thing you're going to do when you're dealing with an argument is you're going to look for a conclusion indicator word. If you find it, then your job is basically done because you found the conclusion. Everything else is going to be support or evidence for the conclusion. However, sometimes you don't find a conclusion indicator. And then if that is the case, then we have to go to step 2. When you're evaluating an argument and you do not find any conclusion indicator, the next step that you're going to take is that you're going to start looking for premise indicator words or phrases. This is not as efficient because there's only one conclusion. So if you find it with an indicator, you know you've finished that part of the evaluation. However, by searching for premise indicator words, if you can find all of the premises in the argument, then you'll have something left over that is being supported by those premises. So the premise indicators will indicate the reasons, and what's left over will be the conclusion. So a partial list of premise indicator words is contained here. The most important is probably because. As the word implies, when you say you should think something because, the because part is giving a reason. So it's functioning as a premise or reason-giving indicator. Some other indicators are since, as, for, and then a whole bunch of synonymous expressions like given that, granted that, provided that, assuming that, seeing that, etc. That is, if you grant that or if you accept this evidence, then you should accept the following conclusion. So these kind of phrases function as premise indicators. So step 1, you look for conclusion indicators. If you do not find a conclusion indicator, then you look for premise indicators. So far, so good. But what do you do when there's no indicator words at all? And that's the step we need to look at next. When there is no indicator word in an argument, the next step you're going to do is you're going to test the first statement. Because very often, when there's no indicator word, the conclusion of the argument will be the first statement in the passage. And the rest of the passage will be providing reasons for that initial assertion. So the reason for this is often that we're taught to put our thesis or our main claim first, and we often do that. That's synonymous with our conclusion. So we're taught to put our conclusion first and then put our reasons afterwards. Now, this is not foolproof. There will be some arguments where the conclusion is not the first statement, even though there's no indicator. However, in the vast majority of cases, when there's no indicator word, the conclusion will usually be the first statement. Now, you can't use that rule to go on autopilot. You still have to think through the argument and ask yourself, is the rest of the passage providing support for this initial statement? And if the answer is yes, then that initial statement is the conclusion, and the rest of the passage is are the premises or the support for that conclusion. Here's an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. The Chargers are definitely going to make the playoffs this year. They've made big improvements on defense and special teams. Also, the offense looks like it will be healthy, and they have added several outstanding wide receivers. They also have an easier schedule this season, and they don't have to play as many teams with winning records as they've had to play in the past or last year. Now, looking over this argument, we're going to use our method. The first thing we do is we look for conclusion indicator words. Words like therefore or thus, consequently. And we don't find any. There is no conclusion indicator in this passage. So then we go to step 2 and we look for premise indicator words. Words like because or since. And as we go through the passage, we see no, there are none of those either. So there's no conclusion indicator and there are no premise indicators. So then our assumption is going to be that the first statement is the conclusion, that the Chargers are definitely going to make the playoffs this year. Now, if this is indeed the conclusion, the rest of the passage should be providing reasons why we should accept that conclusion. Why should I think the Chargers are going to make the playoffs? Well, let's look at the following claims. They've made big improvements on defense and special teams. Is that a reason? Yes, it is. The offense looks like it's healthy, and they've added several outstanding wide receivers. Is that a reason? Yes, it's another reason, and so on throughout the rest of the passage. So we see that these subsequent statements are providing reasons for the initial statement. So the first statement is the conclusion, and the rest of the statements are the evidence for the conclusion. Now keep in mind, at this point, we're just looking at the parts of an argument, and I'm not making any claims as to whether this is a good argument or a bad argument, but it is an argument. It has the requisite features an argument has to have. It has a conclusion, and it offers reasons for that conclusion. If you follow this method, you'll find that it works almost every time, and you'll almost never get to step 4. But sometimes you will have no conclusion indicator, no premise indicators, and you look at the first statement and that's not the conclusion. It doesn't seem as though the rest of the passage is supporting it. Well, at that point, then you have to proceed systematically and ask yourself, okay, well, is the second statement the conclusion? Well, if it is the conclusion, then the rest of the passage should be supporting it, including the first statement. And so if that is the case, then the second statement would be the conclusion and the rest would be the premises. If not, then you have to go to the third statement and so on. Eventually, if you have an argument, you will be able to find the conclusion by going systematically through the argument. However, Like I said, this last step you will rarely encounter, and if you're consciously looking for indicator words, and if there's no indicator word, you're looking at that first statement, most of the time you won't get to this point. But sometimes you will, and it's nice to know that there's this last-ditch effort that you can make that will help you to find the conclusion. Here's an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. This is an argument. Airplane travel has become a major hassle these days. You have to wait in line forever, and the TSA agents are always rude. They really ought to hire more TSA agents and train them better in public service. If there were more well-trained agents, then everything would go more smoothly and travel would become more pleasant instead of the ordeal that it has turned into. So again, we use our step-by-step method, and I will do this more briefly than I did in the previous example. There are no conclusion indicator words. There's no premise indicator words. So then we test the first statement. Airplane travel has become a major hassle these days. Now, is the rest of the passage providing support for that claim, or is that claim providing support for another claim? It doesn't seem as though this is an argument for airplane travel being a hassle. Rather, it seems as though the fact that airplane travel has become a hassle is a reason for another claim. And as we go systematically through the passage, we come to the third statement, that they really ought to hire more TSA agents and train them better in public service. Now, if this is the conclusion, the rest of the passages in the surrounding paragraph should support that. And the first statement, that airline travel has become a hassle and you have to wait in line forever and the agents are rude, these are reasons for the conclusion, for the claim that they ought to hire and train TSA agents better. And then the last passage, if there were more well-trained agents, then everything would go more smoothly and so forth. That also provides support. So here we have an example of a relatively typical argument where the conclusion is right in the middle of the statement. Some reasons are given kind of as an introduction that support the conclusion, which is in the middle, and then the passage concludes with additional reasons to shore up the conclusion. This is not an unusual structure, and it is very common in ordinary communication where we're less concerned with formal, well-developed arguments, and we just kind of speak naturally and develop our ideas naturally. However, even though that is the case, using our four-step method, we can eventually find the conclusion of this argument. Now we know what it's about, and now we're in a good position to begin to classify and evaluate this argument to determine if it's a good argument or a bad one. Well, now we've got enough to get started. We now know the basic features of an argument. An argument is making a case for a claim. That claim is called the conclusion, and an argument only has one conclusion. And the reasons that we should accept that claim or that conclusion are called the premises. So an argument consists of at least one premise, usually more, in support of a conclusion, and there's only one. Now, that, of course, indicates our strategy in terms of how we analyze an argument. Since there's only one, it would be most efficient, if there's only one conclusion, to seek the conclusion first, rather than try to sort out all the premises. And that's basically what our strategy advocates, is to first try to find the conclusion, and only when that fails, then do we use a process of elimination and find all the premises, and then isolate the conclusion that way. So now it's time to practice this, and what you'll find posted after this lecture within the module are some exercises that are from the textbook that I wrote, but I've posted them as separate exercises, where your task is simply to find the conclusion of the various arguments using the method that I indicated. After this, you will find a review of the exercises, an answer key, so you can check your answers. And of course, along the way, if there are any of the exercises that are puzzling to you, or you get a result that doesn't accord with what I have posted, please post that. I'm not infallible. Sometimes I may even make a mistake in an answer key, or perhaps I didn't make a mistake and I can clarify where your understanding may need some assistance. All right, so on to the exercises, and then that'll pretty much bring this initial introductory module to a completion, and we will have mastered the first of our basic skills.